Tynan Portillo presents, featuring the best horror stories of the 19th century. Welcome to the Poe Show podcast. Narrated by Tynan Portillo. Today's episode, The Haunted Palace by Edgar Allan Poe. In the greenest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once a fair and stately palace, radiant palace, reared its head. In the monarch thought's dominion, it stood there. Never seraph spread opinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious, golden, on its roof did float and flow. This, all this, was in the olden time long ago, and every gentle air that dallied in that sweet day, along the ramparts plumed and pallid, a winged odor went away. Wanderers in that happy valley through two luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well-tuned law, round about a throne where, sitting Porphyrogene, in state his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm was seen. And all with pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes, whose sweet duty was but to sing, in voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things, in robes of sorrow, assailed the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never sorrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. And travelers now within that valley through the red-litten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while like a ghastly rapid river through the pale door a hideous throng rush out forever, and laugh but smile no more. Hello from the Poe Show. I am your host, Tynan Portillo. If you enjoyed this episode, then subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and basically any other platform. Give this podcast a good rating and help share it with two people whom you know love Edgar Allan Poe. It first appeared as an independent poem in Nathan Brooks' American magazine in 1839. I found a lot of conflicting information on that, though. It seems like Poe tried to publish it throughout 1839 in different magazines, but he had a lot of trouble doing so, probably due to the fact that his main literary rival, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, made claims that Poe had plagiarized his own poem, Beleaguered City. Poe, of course, shot back, "No, you," and claimed Longfellow was the plagiarist. So Poe did not originally write this poem for the fall of the House of Usher. He just later incorporated it into the story. And who knows, perhaps this poem inspired him to write the story too. Here's an interesting story I came across. Roger Corman, a director, producer, and actor known as the Pope of pop cinema, had plenty of acclaim for producing very successful adaptations of Poe's works. In 1963, he was working on a movie that was to be an adaptation of an H.P. Lovecraft story, but the studio said they didn't think audiences would find Lovecraft popular, so they had him change the title of the movie to The Haunted Palace to get more people to the movie because more people liked Poe. In The Fall of the House of Usher, this poem is meant to symbolize the legacy and prophecy of the House of Usher, that a kingdom full of wisdom and beauty becomes plagued by evil things in robes of sorrow and becomes a fragment of its former self. As a standalone poem, it says about the same thing. The palace is represented as a human head in the dominion of thought, and it's infused with exaggeration and hyperbole to show how good this palace is. Now, why would it be a head? Well, it could be that the palace just represents someone falling into mental anguish and madness. That's exactly what happens in the House of Usher, and it makes total sense in the context of the poem. The word, I had trouble with this before, porphyrogene. The word porphyrogene means purple born and refers to someone either of royalty or being born of royalty, the purple referring to the royalty, reinforcing the fact that thought is the ruler and the royalty of this palace. And the duty of the echoes coming and going through the ornate palace door is to sing to the wisdom of their king. The pearl and ruby around the door are used as metaphors to show that the door of the palace is like a mouth, pearl probably referring to skin, and then the ruby, the lips. The luminous windows are the eyes, as eyes are the windows to the soul. And the echoes flowing through the door can be seen in my eyes as like a voice, either voices of ancestors or just a human voice in general. If it is a single human voice, it's more likely that the metaphorical person is singing their own praises and has an issue with pride. The windows then become flooded with a red light, maybe to represent falling into madness or being read from sadness and weeping. So in all, this poem is meant to be a metaphor for someone becoming plagued by depression. I wonder if it was also a bit of a a self-expression and kind of Poe talking about what he was going through, but this metaphorical person becoming plagued by depression falls in line almost exactly with what I discussed in The Fall of the House of Usher. That story and this poem are expressions of how someone's mental state can be plagued by mental illness and rob them of former glory days when they were looked upon as glorious. But the throng that floods from the pale palace door now smile, but laugh no more. So really, when I had theorized in the House of Usher episode that it was about mental illness and depression, I was kind of hitting the nail on the head there. And it's funny because the more I read of Poe, the more I begin to see that he had a desire to bring people closer to facing their own demons, rather than just be a scary storyteller. His works always speak deeper than the surface level. On the surface, he draws audiences and readers in by creating a macabre mood and discussing sometimes grotesque story elements, but there's always something for readers to digest when they look a little deeper. One of his most popular stories, The Telltale Heart, does this as well. By the way, if any of you would like to hear that story on this podcast, let me know and I will do it. Just leave a comment on the Poe Show YouTube channel or email poeshowpod@gmail.com. Anyway, The Telltale Heart on the surface is about a man who loses his mind and kills his boss and believes he was sane the whole time. But if you look deeper, it's about a man who fears death and who goes to great lengths to prove to his ego that death cannot conquer him. But in the end, he admits defeat to his fear. I'll talk more about that if you guys would like an episode on that story. As for The Haunted Palace, it seems to serve the narrative purpose of examining how a person can be torn down by sorrow and depression, something Poe was very experienced in. I mean, his father left his family when Poe was just a boy. Poe lost most of his family to tuberculosis. His wife died to tuberculosis. He was a constant alcoholic and drug abuser and a consistent self-sabotager. I am sure that Poe felt his life was at the whim of forces beyond his comprehension and control, and only found solace in exploring the writing of literature that gave a glimpse into that kind of journey. Keep in mind also that Poe lived in a time when plenty of wealthy people romanticized the idea of falling ill to tuberculosis. They called it consumption at that time. It was a custom of the time to be seen as more attractive if you were paler in skin, had redder lips, and looked essentially more like a corpse. You ever seen Victorian makeup for the wealthy? They're trying to look dead. That's what they thought was attractive back then. So imagine Poe having lost his birth mother, his adoptive mother, his wife, and his brother to this disease, is seeing the wealthy and royalty of the world glamorize it, which probably led to his portrayal of death as a more morbid depiction, which led American pop culture to adopt that idea, and that's how we look at death today, more of a depressing and macabre kind of topic. But I think we lost a bit of Poe's original idea. Death and sorrow and fear can be immobilizing, but looking at a work like The Raven, also on this podcast, it's not something to run away from. It's something to face, understand, and mourn. Now, Poe in American literature and culture is a legend right now. He was not when he was a writer. When he was first writing, and even through most of his career, people kind of knew about him, but he had no fame. He lived in squalor, and part of that, I think, was also his alcoholism. He also was a pretty avid gambler at certain times and gained a lot of debt, owed some people some money. But he wasn't smart with his money, but he also just wasn't making a whole lot of money on his stories anyway. And he died in squalor. And I think it's really inspiring to see how far his stories have lived beyond his time. And looking back at the Haunted Palace, where, he's talking about this kingdom where there are these green valleys and ornate doors and all of these beautiful things, really talking about the beauty of these former glory days. I wonder if he either was talking about early days in his career or early days in his childhood. If it's early days in his career, it's interesting for me to think about, because when he first started his career, he gained some popularity, but then as he went on, he was also a very harsh critic. Like he would tear other writers apart in critic columns in the newspaper. So, he was by no means a very friendly guy, but I wonder if as his career seemed to take a nosedive, if that's something that made him want to write The Haunted Palace. Because again, 1839, that was just about a decade before his death. So I don't know. I really just appreciate that we have these records of Poe. It's not just stories that he has written. It's the way he saw the world. It's the creativity he spun into existence. And that's one reason why I love reading these things and love reading original manuscripts. I mean, I have as part of my library a novel called Guy Deverell by J.S. Le Fanu, and it's from the classic reprint series, which take original documents and manuscripts and essentially scan them and preserve the original documents. And I was looking through this novel, and it, how in older print they would have S's look like F's for some reason. I can't remember why that was, but this document has that. This novel, the original manuscript, has that. And I love preserving those things in our history and in our time, especially when it comes to literature, because we preserve how people viewed the world at that point. And I think that's really, really important. Now, thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Poe Show. If you'd like to hear any other 19th century poems or stories on this podcast, again, leave a comment on the YouTube channel or email poeshowpod@gmail.com. That's poeshowpod@gmail.com. And you can hear stories that you've suggested on the podcast. Again, if you like this content, please subscribe and leave a good rating. That helps the podcast to, be exposed to more people. and share it with your other family and friends. That's all for now, but you'll hear from me again on the next episode of The Poe Show.